I would like to have your attention again. Well, I would like to introduce you this audience of alumni and the audience of the directors of the schools, all those present here from the Council of Europe. I want to introduce you to somebody very new to the school, an expert professor, academician. Yes, I know very well. And a rector of the European Humanitarian President, Humanitarian University for the Humanities in Minsk. And the city of Minsk is, Lev Dmitrich, it's not even Moscow. So, for this reason, Lev Dmitrievich, and in 2004, it was clearly shown, because we were shown what it would be like in 2014, and they got it back in 2004, that they are an unwanted people for Minsk and for Belarus, and they all moved to the wonderful, beautiful city of Vilnius. Now, I together with Yura, I attended their 25th anniversary exactly 4 days ago in Vilnius. And I was amazed by the fact that the meeting was attended from very high-ranking officials from Europe, and they all said, we think it important and we think it's necessary that this university should carry on, because it is producing this sort of, that many people, internationally minded people, who are in line with the modern world. And indeed, our meeting today was opened by the president of this foundation, by SIDA, by the Swedish Parliament. They were all there, and they said they will continue their support for the university. And I don't know who did that, but they did a fantastic refurbishment of what used to be a monastery where this university is moving to. In the Berezkina, really moved there to be able to see you, how you train your students over there. I met Anatoly together with Yura. It was, how long? It was 6 months ago, and indeed it produced quite an impression on me, because there was a time, when was that? I don't remember. It was 1996 or maybe 86 or 87 maybe, 86 probably, when Anatoly came to us to have dinner. Yuta, don't be upset, with a great philosopher, Habermas, with his wife, and we had a conversation, and he spoke German to them. And thank goodness I didn't have to practice my poor English, because Habermas says intelligent things, but he can't understand a word, can't understand anything about it. In my biography, I now have this picture on dinner where I entertained Habermas at home. Not so bad for my biography, and we had a conversation in my kitchen, and it was 30 years since we saw each other, and then all of a sudden a meeting like this, and it's really great. And Yura and I, and Inna and I, we thought that whatever Anatoly Arseevich says, academician and a man indeed, a philosopher to begin with, secondly, a true person, a true humanist would be very important. And I now give the floor to him as he will address this audience. Thank you so much. Well, thank you, Lena, for these warm words of introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and of course it's very difficult to speak at the end of the day. Although, actually, generally speaking, it's hard to speak in public, because one has to say something and not just waste people's time. I'll try to give an explanation for the topic of my presentation, which, at first sight, may be something like a declaration. It is far from that. The organizers do know that originally I was supposed that I would have to speak in English, and it would be much simpler for me to speak in English, although I would prefer not an indefinite circle, rather the definite article for my presentation. But in Russian, as you know, there is no such thing as articles, and this problem is no longer with you, but you immediately see another problem. What is this conversation about then? Because I thought that we would discuss a certain kind of activity and those who are involved in this activity, which in the European culture are known as intellectuals. In Russian, I would find it very hard to find a word to translate it into Russian, because intelligentsia, the word intelligentsia, although it seems to be in line, but has a very different connotation. In German, there is a word Intelligenz, but again, it means something else. And I'd like to draw your attention immediately how difficult communication and mutual understanding are. And today, when we are in the audience of like-minded people, how during the day and at the end of our discussion, look at this pretty emotional debate, and how often we use the word or some notion implying that we would expect that our interlocutor would resonate with that, and his preparedness to resonate with this notion. But it is very far from that. Once Georgy Ivanov wrote about the dimming evening hour and the river and the fence in the fog. What is it that brings us all together? Mutual misunderstanding. I don't want to dramatize the problem of lack of understanding, although in the middle of the 20th century, Georg Gadamer, an outstanding thinker, wrote a remarkable article, The Unfähige alte Sprache, the inability for conversation. It's highly symptomatic. We live in a time when, in the time of the globalization in particular, we need to find proper words, to find the right words, so that what we would do what the Germans call Gerede, in English they call it talkativeness, in Russia just boltavня, because we've seen too much of that, really too much of that. And going back to my presentation, I'd like this wording to serve for all of us as a certain warning, a warning so that we would not be too confident that our conversation and our talks, including my presentation right now, should be overestimated. Let's agree that, in general, we, strictly speaking, do not control our own life. Tomorrow, alas, let's hope nothing would happen to us, but anything could happen. And instead we are contemplating what may happen, what trajectories of public development, social development, we refer to the experience of the epochs long gone, and so on and so forth. The question is to which extent are words, in German Wörter, not Wörter. There is a very serious difference there, and here we spoke about the word. To which extent we, in point, will find the right words, so that we should not waste words, spend the words in vain, words and words. Instead, we seek to express something that is in line with the challenges of this day and our existence here and now. Why did I choose this topic for my presentation? In 1942, an outstanding Spanish thinker, Ortega y Gasset, it was just in the heat of the Second World War, was writing a whole book. A whole book could be dedicated on the subject responsibility and irresponsibility. And then he just explains. And at the same time, this topic is part of a broader subject when we contemplate about intellectual responsibility. Hence the question, that happens at the height of the Second World War, when the human lives are lost, but he contemplates the responsibility of philosopher. Why is that the case? We know that in 1929, Ortega published a book, The Uprising of the Masses, which until now has not yet been properly contemplated, including our time, for the time of populism, and in many ways we may describe this time in different terms, but Ortega y Gasset really shows what he means by this. What kind of people are they that are known as intellectuals, and that are, in ancient times, were known as bios theoreticus. As Han Iron wrote later, they are people who are known as thinkers by their profession. And this sort of property, this thing that once was born but was never considered to be a profession. Socrates was not a professor of philosophy in his day, and later the philosophy and say those who took part, Spinoza was not a professional teacher in the higher school and had no titles and had no special positions. But the thing is that thinking about this space in room where these thinkers lived was something that they dedicated their lives to. But then gradually that would be turning away, and these insights by Kierkegaard in the middle 19th century, although they belonged to something very dangerous profession that was dangerous for the European culture. He was at that time speaking about journalism. Can you imagine what kind of journalism was it like in the mid-19th century? But for Søren Kierkegaard, a very dangerous phenomenon, what he called a special kind of people who seem to know it all, who can speak about anything else, and are not at all accountable for what they do. They just return judgments on people. They make evaluations and assessments. They provide recommendations. And they are, as he says in his... They have got immunity towards any deeds. To do something wrong, even they are unable to do that. And they only talk. Talkativeness is something typical of them. This is something that is becoming a very dangerous symptom. That something that was probably maturing in the European culture. Thank goodness he never lived to see the time of internet, where the problem of disintegration between the reader and the writer, this dividing line between the reader and the writer merged. And the problem that this sort of idea about humans, that there are special kind of activity that is divided from your practice, something that exists per se, and which makes a person confident that he or she can provide recommendations, can criticize, can just give recommendations and counsels. In the 20th century that has now gone, that was the century from which we probably never made any lesson, didn't learn any lessons. I realize why that happened. At the end of the last third of this century, the standoff between the two camps ended. The Cold War was over. The reunification of Germany happened. The Soviet Union integrated, as Reagan called it, the empire of the evil. And it seemed like all things have been addressed. I suppose, as we were seeing in 2001, many people in older generation remember that, as usual. The psychological feeling that it has to do with new expectations, with trying to sum up what happened before, that it was not just a new year, but also we ushered in a new millennium, moreover, third millennium. There's something that made us particularly enthusiastic and gave us special hopes. Hope is the fundamental principle of human life. And we thought that the horrible epoch of the 20th century is over. But we forgot that as early as in the 1950s, 1960s, in their radical deliberations about the nature of things that happened, Hannah Arendt diagnosed this epoch in a very profound manner. He said that thinking and reality were parted company. And she said, in addition, reality stopped being transparent for the light of thinking. She was not alone. Before that, we saw attempts to contemplate that something is looming over us, something might happen. In the 1910s, Wilhelm Wimbledbart urged the German nation not to turn into oblivion the heritage of thinkers, because he thought that would be dangerous for the German culture. But it never helped. The First World War did happen. The forebodings of Ortega and Gasset in the uprising of the masses were never heard. The question is, to which extent of energy our words should carry in order for them to reach the audience.
We live in an era of the internet, of the mass media, and at all times we live between the senior generation and the younger generation, which are often worlds apart. However, hope to find a response in this young generation, which is almost losing interest or capacity of reading, may be leading us to think that we are seeing a new species being born. So the important problem which is in front of us, which is the indeed results of the first 25 years of this school, is what kind of enlightenment are we seeking at the time of during the age of reason, during the age of the thinkers of the Enlightenment. There was an generalized idea that having drunk the bitter cup of violence, humans, when illumined and enlightened, would stop committing the terrible crimes. And there was a hope that the vice can be abated. However, we are in a different world now. We are seeing a problem which needs to be considered more deeply than we have done so far. I'm talking about the deep divide that started, of course, from the classical antiquity and then continued through to Descartes' times when human was perceived as a rational being, a being who is exhausted by the reason. Indeed, a human does not have that set of particularities and properties that even the simplest of organisms have in their survival, like the protozoans, which means that we as humans need to be cultivated to survive. This is not something that can be done during indoctrination or imposing from the outside. But the problem of knowledge, the problem of cognizance has a danger whereby human is then dried up to these formulas of knowledge. In the German tradition of polemical writing, there was a certain understanding that not unlike that every one of us, and that we do not predetermine the place of our birth, our culture. In the same way, we live through language. And the language is what predetermines our life and our existence more than we could think of. When we make a judgment about some question, then very often an attempt to cleanse our mind from everything translated by tradition, culture, from everything which is implicit, and that is not perceived as something that yields to analysis, that fades. Gadamer said that prejudice, more than judgment, dictates our behavior. We have to find a way, we have to find means to understand what is the task of education. Let us try to give ourselves account that in the post-Soviet times, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the communist system on the whole, we have seen a huge number of new educational institutions springing up, and mostly not in the sphere of natural science or physics, but in the sphere of humanities and social sciences. These institutions are not able to survive unless understood properly. A traditional understanding of education is reduced to the fact that if some has reason, mental faculties, that something can be conveyed at, say, a seminar or an examination. Kant wrote that the subject of mathematics is simple and clear. The subject of metaphysics, which is the problems of metaphysics, the problems which the human is prompted to answer but does not find answers. How is it possible to consider these problems. How is it possible to involve a human into these problems of metaphysics for the human to grow through and in us? Even Hannah Arendt, when analyzing the terrible tragedy of the German people and understanding that the banality of evil is not just about a shortage of education or lack of knowledge. There were many educated persons among those who committed the heinous crimes. So we come across the situation when the problem of responsibility, and Hannah Arendt had a work on responsibility and judgment. She tried to finish her book, her last book, which is called Life of the Mind. And she could not do that. Death arrested her in writing the most important section of the book. She wanted to devote this part of the book to Urteil, which is judgment. Judgment, as Urteil, has many connotations in German which are very difficult to reproduce in other languages, because Urteil shows that the subject and predicate, as members of any utterance, are coupled with respect to some unified base, to some general foundation, that exists deep inside and that is divided between the subject and the predicate. This ontological peculiarity of the human existence is often evading us in our vision from the rational discourse, because it's a result. Baratinsky said, "There is the existence, but what name should I give?" The Russian poet Baratinsky says, "What name should I give to this existence?" Which is an existentialist question. As we understand, there is this emotional limit which we simply cannot trespass in the framework, or we cannot cross, indeed, rather, in the framework of our language. So one of the conclusions of our meeting today could be an understanding in higher of the need of higher interaction, that we have to continue and rebuild the bridges between people and nations alike. There is no such thing as a provincial study. There can be no isolation, and there is no triumph in isolation. We have to continue and move forward together. And today we spoke about critical remarks from the European countries who are often self-critical. Indeed, a lot was perceived in terms of the good expectations, but unfortunately we have to stop resting our hopes on just conferences, seminars, and publications. Every year we are seeing that about 1.5 million of articles published in the refereed journals, of which a lion part is simply never read. We are multiplying this production of this literature, hoping that it may change the world. This may well happen conversely. We are trying to compensate our inability to act, our inability to have a deed. And this is what Raymond Aron spoke about in his book, The Crisis of Intelligentsia. And of course he spoke about the intellectuals. He spoke about those who believe that they have a knowledge and they think they know what they can do, but they're telling others. Let me just conclude by the words of Aristotle, who wrote in the Politics, the treatise of politics, that to teach others to do something, you have to know how to do it yourself. Only then the voice of those who can do something will be heard differently. And I think that Yuri and Lena have been doing this in practice. And the differentiation between theory and practice, the belief that there is the theory and then we shall apply it to practice, this is an empty phrase. Aristotle wrote in the Nicomachean Ethics about a certain way of knowledge, phronesis, which is a moral judgment, a behavioral model, something that we're often losing, and sometimes it seems to us that the spells that we utter and the mantras that we voice, we can solve problems or things. This is probably not true, because nobody will do and respond to the challenges instead of us. Thank you very much for your attention.